Stop. Not to watch a video, but to face yourself. I only have one question. And if you dare to answer it truthfully, it might shatter every illusion you've ever held. About love. About emotion. About the man you thought you were. Have you ever been in love? Not with a person, but so deeply that you lost yourself. You sat for hours, waiting on a single text. Your hands trembled when you saw the word seen. You wrote paragraphs apologizing for things that weren't your fault. You clenched your teeth, forcing yourself not to call, not to chase. While she slowly walked away, you called it love, depth, loyalty. But Spinoza didn't call that emotion. He called it slavery. Not because you couldn't feel, but because you felt too much. You reacted without understanding, sacrificed without control, gave everything, while keeping nothing for yourself. You thought you were strong, but the truth is, you were being ruled by your emotions. Spinoza said, once an emotion is understood, it stops being an emotion. He didn't oppose the feelings. He just said one thing: if you don't master your emotions, they will destroy you. You think she left because you were too cold. No, she left because you were weak. Not because you were quiet, but because your feelings were cheap, always available, always desperate. You thought it was love, but you were addicted to being loved, more than you respected yourself. And then you meet a different kind of man. He doesn't write long messages. He doesn't ask, "Did you get home safe?" He doesn't panic, doesn't beg, doesn't break when left behind. Not because he's cold, but because he once burned in the fire of his own emotions. And now, that fire can't touch him anymore. They call him heartless. But Spinoza calls him free. What about you? Are you free? Or are you still a slave to feelings you never learned to understand? Or worse, are you still burning in a fire that already consumed you long ago, but you're too afraid to see the ashes? There is a kind of man still walking among us. On the surface, he looks normal. He speaks with confidence. He believes he is in control. But look closer. He is not living. He is reacting to every message, every look, every pause in attention. And if you take away the woman he clings to, he collapses. Not because he is weak by nature, but because his emotional world was never truly his. It belonged to her. Spinoza would call him possessed. Not by demons, not by others, but by his own unexamined emotions. You see, men are not taught to understand their feelings, only to express them. Cry it out, talk it out, show her you care. But no one tells you what happens when your feelings become currency. When you're too easy to hurt, too quick to speak, too desperate to apologize, you don't become deep, you become cheap. And cheap emotions are never respected. Spinoza saw this centuries ago. He wrote that emotion is not strength. Emotion is confusion. It's what happens when your inner world is ruled by what happens outside of you. When someone else's silence can tear you apart. That's not love. That's dependence. That's not connection. That's erasure. You weren't bonding. You were begging, and the moment she sensed it, she lost interest. Not because you didn't feel, but because your feelings were always on display, too easy to access, too exposed. And Spinoza warned us, anything that can be moved by another is not free. Think about that. If a single message can change your entire day, someone else owns you. If she can make you spiral, panic, lose control, she already owns you. And what do most men do? They try harder. They write more, explain more, give more. They confuse desperation with depth. That's the tragedy, because deep down, they think this makes them good men. Men who care, who feel, who stay. But Spinoza saw through that illusion. He never said don't feel. He said, feel intelligently. And there is nothing intelligent about sacrificing yourself without boundaries. Nothing noble about emotional dependency. It is slavery, wrapped in the perfume of romance. You weren't in love. You were undefended. You weren't committed. You were unraveling in real time, because the man who cannot lead himself emotionally will always follow her chaos. She pulls back. You chase. She grows cold. You grow louder. She wounds you, and you apologize. Not from strength, but from fear. Fear of losing. Fear of rejection. Fear of being alone. And that fear is the fuel of every emotionally enslaved man. He believes the more he gives, the more she will stay. But giving without discernment does not create closeness. It creates disgust, because she sees the truth. You don't love her from strength. You need her from weakness. And no woman wants to carry the weight of a man who cannot carry himself. That is why she leaves. Not because you didn't give enough, but because what you gave cost you too much. You placed your soul on the table, like spare change, and she treated it that way. This is what Spinoza wanted us to understand. Freedom begins when you examine your emotions, when you clarify them, organize them, command them. Only then do they stop controlling you. Only then are you no longer the puppet of your own emotional storms. Because the man who never studies his emotions always becomes their servant. And the saddest part is this. He calls it love. He turns emotional chaos into a badge of honor. He believes pain proves sincerity. But pain without understanding is just noise. So I ask you, are you truly in love? Or are you just addicted to being needed? Are you building connection? Or are you bleeding just to feel alive? Most men don't know the difference, but the man who wakes up does. And once he sees it clearly, he never bleeds the same again. If this part spoke to something inside you, leave a like. Share it with a brother who needs to hear this. Subscribe for more work that doesn't just go viral, it goes deep. And if you want to support this kind of content, you can do so through the super thanks below. Your presence here means more than you know. They told you to open up, to be vulnerable, to let her see the real you. And you believed them. You thought, if you gave her everything, she would never leave. If you stayed soft, even while breaking, she would see your depth and love you more for it. But no one warned you. Sensitivity without sovereignty is not depth, it is exposure. It's a man turned inside out, bleeding in public, calling it honesty. You thought you were being real, but what you were was unguarded. You believed that sharing your pain made you worthy, that giving her access to every fear would make her stay. But what she felt wasn't connection. It was weight. It was pressure. You gave her everything before she proved she could hold anything. That's not intimacy. That's emotional self-abandonment, dressed up in the costume of love. Real depth is selective. It doesn't reveal itself on impulse. It waits. It watches. It chooses. You thought vulnerability meant openness, but you forgot the one thing that gives vulnerability power: boundaries. Without them, your truth becomes noise. Your story becomes a flood. And your pain becomes her burden. You told her your darkest thoughts. You broke in her arms. You gave your soul before she gave you her trust. And when she left, you blamed her coldness. But the truth is, you handed her a responsibility she never asked for. You asked her to prove your worth. But that's not her job. Even the ones who love you don't want to carry your self-worth on their back. Because love isn't born through exposure. It's born through integrity. And integrity means knowing when to feel, when to speak, and how to carry your pain without leaking it everywhere. You thought your vulnerability would pull her closer. But what you gave her wasn't intimacy. It was saturation. And saturation exhausts. Not because emotion is wrong, but because raw emotion, without filter, overwhelms, floods, drowns. Spinoza saw this. He didn't say hide your feelings. He said, refine them, bring order to the storm, study what moves you, before you offer it to someone else. Because when you master your emotions, you don't need to bleed to be seen. You don't need to fall apart to prove you're real. You don't need to collapse just to feel alive. You are deep. You are human, but only if you can stand inside your pain, without turning it into performance. Most men are not disrespected because they feel too little. They are disrespected because they reveal too much, too fast, too often. They cry early. They confess too soon. They break open before any trust is built. And it kills gravity, because gravity doesn't pour. It holds. It anchors. It's felt in silence, in restraint, in timing. That's the difference between true depth and emotional exposure. One draws her in, the other makes her step back. So ask yourself, are you being honest? Or are you bleeding for attention? Are you showing depth? Or are you collapsing first, to earn love before she even asks for it? Because the man she respects isn't the one who breaks. It's the one who knows when to break and when to hold. He's not cold. He's composed. He's not silent out of fear. He's silent out of strength. And when he finally opens up, it means something, because not everyone gets access, and that is why she stays. You think she left because you didn't say enough, because you weren't romantic enough, present enough, emotional enough. But what if I told you she didn't leave because you felt too little? She left because your presence had no weight. You made yourself too accessible, too instant, too eager. She didn't have to wonder about you. She didn't have to lean in. Because you were already spilling out, you texted back. Before she even blinked, you apologized. Before she even frowned, you smiled. The moment she returned, no questions, no hesitation. You thought it was love. But to her, it felt like noise. A man who constantly explains himself. Who gives before he's even asked? Who opens the vault before trust is earned? He doesn't look powerful. He looks unanchored, like a boat with no weight, floating toward anything that will catch it. And no woman wants to be the dock for a drifting soul, because that's not connection. That's emotional dependency, disguised as kindness, wrapped in politeness, delivered in desperation. You thought generosity would win her heart. But generosity without boundaries becomes pressure. When every word is a confession, every gesture a performance, every feeling a flood, she's not pulled closer. She's pushed to the edge. Not because she's cruel, but because you're collapsing into her. Instead of standing beside her, Spinoza warned us, when a man is moved too easily, he isn't free. He's reactive, shaped by the external, defined by approval. That's not intimacy. That's erasure. You disappear in your own giving, and she's left. Speaking to a silhouette, you don't have to disappear to be loved. You have to exist before you offer yourself, because when your emotions spill without filter, they lose shape. They lose gravity. You become familiar too fast, predictable too early. And what is predictable is not mysterious. What is always available is never held with care. The paradox is cruel. You give more to earn love, but what you give, when given without pause, begins to feel hollow, like background music, always playing, never noticed. Real presence has silence. Real emotion has restraint. The man who carries weight doesn't speak often, but when he does, it lands like thunder on dry earth. So ask yourself, do your words carry force? Or do they float and vanish? Are you being generous? Or are you performing to prove you're lovable? Because the man who values his inner world doesn't pour it out like water into the street. He protects it. He preserves it. He offers it like gold, measured, earned, and that's what makes it powerful. Most men aren't searching for love. They're searching for a function, a place to belong, a purpose in someone else's world, because they haven't built one of their own. They don't love her soul. They love how she makes them feel about themselves. Useful, important, irreplaceable. It's not connection. It's validation, disguised as intimacy. Spinoza would call this dependency. Not because they're weak, but because their identity is outsourced to affection, to attention, to being needed. You see it in how quickly they jump to fix things, solve, prove, serve. They don't feel worthy, standing still, so they perform. They become the emotional handyman, always on call, always ready, never still enough to ask, what happens if I stop trying? Because that's the fear, not abandonment, but irrelevance. They're terrified of being unnecessary, because being unnecessary means confronting the one question they've never answered. Who am I when no one depends on me? Spinoza warned us, when your emotions aren't examined, they become a disguise. You don't see your anxiety. You see your loyalty. You don't see your fear of self. You see your devotion. You text first. You give more than is asked. You stay longer than is healthy. Not from love, but from habit, a reflex, a desperate need to be relevant. But here's the truth. The more you overfunction, the more invisible you become, because when your presence is tied to utility, you're no longer a man. You're a tool, and tools are only loved until they're no longer needed. When she moves on, you don't just lose her, you lose your mirror. The one that told you, I matter, and in the silence, you mistake her absence for betrayal. But it's not betrayal, it's exposure. The role is gone, and all that's left is you. And you don't know what to do with that silence, because it's not just empty, it's echoing. You didn't lose love, you lost the only place you felt like someone. So ask yourself, are you really in love with her? Or are you in love with the feeling of being chosen? Do you want her? Or do you want the identity you built through her eyes? Because if your self-worth is built on how useful you are to others, you'll spend your life performing, pleasing, overextending, until you collapse. Not from heartbreak, but from carrying a version of yourself that was never real. You weren't her man. You were her role player, a supporting act, in a script she never agreed to direct. And when she left, you weren't abandoned. You were released, returned to a self you had spent years avoiding. So now, you're standing in a cathedral you once called love, but the pews are empty, and the silence is deafening. And for the first time, you realize you were never worshipping her. You were worshipping the version of yourself she helped you forget. Have you ever performed love just to feel needed? Tell your story. Most men think emotional strength means hiding what they feel. But true strength is not silence. It is sovereignty. It is not coldness. It is clarity. The man who feels deeply, yet chooses when and how to express it, is terrifying to those who need control over him. Because he cannot be baited. He cannot be pushed into confession or outburst. He does not bleed on command. And because of that, they fear him. Not because he doesn't feel, but because his feelings are not for sale. He doesn't owe you his pain. He doesn't owe you his history. He doesn't perform his suffering like theater. He holds it, processes it, and speaks when the words are ripe with meaning. That kind of emotional intelligence is rare and misunderstood. They'll call him heartless, a stone, an empty room. But that's because most people only understand emotion when it explodes. They only recognize vulnerability when it cries. But true vulnerability doesn't always cry. Sometimes it stands, still, composed, unshaken. And that stillness feels dangerous because it cannot be read, cannot be manipulated, cannot be owned. Spinoza saw emotion not as fire, but as energy, and energy, when undirected, becomes destruction. But when channeled, it becomes power. That's what this man carries. Power. The power to feel and not drown. The power to care without collapsing. The power to love without begging. He doesn't flinch when you pull away. He doesn't chase validation. He doesn't unravel just because the room goes quiet, because he is no longer addicted to reaction. He responds, not to please, but to speak truth. And if that truth costs him attention, approval, or even intimacy, he pays it willingly, because what he values is not being seen. It is being whole, unshaken by approval, unaffected by silence. He has stopped needing the world to reflect his worth. He reflects it to himself, through discipline, through restraint, through choosing words that serve clarity, not chaos. That's why, when he finally speaks, people listen, because his words are rare, precise, and clean. They don't spill. They land, like truth should. So ask yourself, are you using your emotions to feel powerful or to feel seen? Because the man who is ruled by his emotions performs them to earn space. But the man who masters them creates space wherever he stands. He doesn't yell to be heard. He doesn't bleed to be believed. He simply exists, fully, quietly. And in that quiet, people hear him more than anyone else, because his silence isn't empty. It's designed, and in design, there is dominion. Powerful men are not emotionless. They are economical. They understand something most never learn. What is rare carries gravity. Emotion, like any resource, loses weight when overused. Speak too often, Your voice becomes background noise. Comfort too easily. And your silence becomes a threat. React to everything. And your presence becomes predictable. So they do something radical. They preserve, not to manipulate, but to maintain value. Spinoza believed clarity arises from understanding what moves us and choosing when to respond. If to respond, most men never do this. They hand out their attention, like coins at a festival. Their focus leaks. Their stillness shatters at the smallest noise. And with each reaction, they lose a piece of themselves. You think you're being kind, being emotionally available. But what you're doing is scattering your power. Real strength is not loud. It is concentrated. A man who walks into a room and doesn't speak, yet shifts the air. That's not mystery. That's containment. Because when emotion is always visible, it loses precision. It loses sharpness. It loses shape. You say you care, but you care about everything. And what is everywhere is valued nowhere. Emotional minimalism isn't coldness. It's calculated presence. It's knowing what deserves your energy and what deserves your silence. You don't owe everyone an explanation. You don't need to prove your empathy. You don't have to react just to seem real. You are real, but only if you stop leaking your soul through every open door. Spinoza saw emotion not as chaos, but as energy. And like all energy, it must be directed, or it destroys. The strongest men are not those who feel the most. They are those who channel their feeling like water through stone. Controlled, steady, intentional. They don't offer their heart. In the first conversation, they don't reply, just to fill the silence. They don't panic when left on red, because they've made peace with something deeper. Not every emotion needs to be expressed. Some must be observed. Some must be held. Some must be saved. For moments that matter. So if you want to be powerful, stop bleeding your presence into spaces that don't echo it back. Speak less, but mean more. Give less, but anchor deeper, and let your restraint be the loudest thing in the room. Because power isn't in how much you show, it's in how much you protect. Power doesn't always show up as dominance. Sometimes it shows up as silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty. It's deliberate, measured, strategic. Most people think power means controlling others. But real power begins with not needing anything from them. Not their approval, not their reply, not even their presence. Because the moment you need something to feel complete, you've already handed them the blueprint to dismantle you. Spinoza saw this clearly. He believed suffering doesn't come from what happens, but from our attachment to how it should be. You're not crushed because she walked away. You're crushed because you thought she shouldn't. You're not angry because they rejected you. You're angry because you expected otherwise. That expectation is the leash, and indifference is the knife. But don't confuse this with apathy. Apathy is numbness. Strategic indifference is choice. It's the art of holding your center when the world tries to tug you into reaction. You don't chase closure. You don't argue for clarity. You don't explain your worth to people who refuse to see it the first time. Because you've learned, the one who doesn't flinch controls the room. When chaos enters, others react. But you don't. You observe. You calculate. You decide if it even deserves a response. And sometimes, the most dominant move is no move at all. You become the still frame in a shaky camera, the quiet player who already knows how the game ends. They call you heartless, detached, distant, but they misunderstand. You're not cold, you're in control, because you've stopped spending emotional currency on what won't return it. You've stopped paying rent in spaces that drain your light, and in that restraint, you become unpredictable, not because you're dangerous, but because you're no longer available for manipulation. You don't flinch, you don't explain, you don't fill the silence, just to feel seen. You become the mirror, reflecting everything, absorbing nothing. Spinoza once wrote, "He who is guided by reason is free, because reason chooses, reaction obeys." And most men live like dogs to their emotions, panting, barking, chasing. But you become the storm that never breaks, the wave that waits, the mountain that watches. So the next time you're pulled into drama, pause and ask yourself, is this worth my weight? Because the man who holds his gravity never needs to prove it. There's a man in every room. He doesn't speak much. He doesn't interrupt. He doesn't fight for the spotlight. But somehow, everyone feels him. They adjust their posture when he walks in. They measure their words more carefully, even in silence. He bends the room. That's not charisma. That's not status. That is aura. And aura is not created by noise. It's forged in restraint. It's built quietly, in stillness, in solitude, in sovereignty. You don't develop presence by demanding attention. You develop it by mastering energy. The man with quiet aura doesn't need validation because he's already made peace with being misunderstood. He doesn't chase attention because he knows the most powerful things in life don't move loudly. Storms don't ask to be feared. They just arrive. Spinoza saw the root of suffering as attachment to external impressions. But when you let go of the need to be seen, you begin to glow, not for them, but for yourself. Quiet aura is built in solitude. In the hours you spend listening more than speaking. In the discipline to pause before reacting. In the ability to remain centered. When chaos knocks, people feel that. They feel the difference between a man who performs confidence and a man who is confidence. Because one seeks approval, the other emits clarity. Your presence becomes undeniable when your silence is deliberate, when your actions are consistent, when your emotions don't spill over, when your energy walks in 10 seconds. Before you do, and even if you leave the room, your absence lingers. Why? Because in a world of noise, your restraint is unforgettable. The man with quiet aura doesn't fear rejection. He fears wasting energy. He doesn't show up to prove anything. He shows up to observe, to calculate, to understand. And when he speaks, people listen. Not because he's loud, but because he's earned every word. Aura is not about being known. It's about being felt. You don't need to impress. You need to become so internally aligned that people feel unsafe trying to shake you. Because when your calm is unbothered, your presence becomes dangerous. Not like a threat, but like gravity, inescapable, invisible, undeniable. And if your absence still echoes after you're gone, that's not silence. That's presence perfected. Reaction is currency, and most people are broke because they spend it everywhere. They give it to the insult, to the silence, to the indifference. They let their peace be rented by anyone with an opinion. But here's the truth. You don't rise by reacting. You rise by restraining. You don't become untouchable by winning every argument. You become untouchable by walking away from the battlefield entirely. Because power isn't loud, it's still. When you stop reacting, the world loses its grip on you. That toxic ex, that manipulative boss, that fake friend, they don't know what to do with a man who won't flinch, because their power was never in who they were. It was in your reaction to them. You made them big by shrinking yourself. You gave them volume by turning down your own frequency. Spinoza said, "Freedom is the understanding of necessity." Once you see the pattern, it stops controlling you. And most patterns are simple. They trigger you. You react. They win. Break the pattern, and you break the illusion. You stop reacting to disrespect. You stop reacting to silence. You stop reacting to not being chosen. Because none of those things define you anymore. You've stepped outside the game. And once you're out, you can see it for what it really is. A trap, a test, a mirror. And you no longer feel the need to pass. You no longer need to prove that you're worthy of staying, of being understood, of being loved. Because you finally understand something deeper. You don't need to be chosen. You need to choose yourself. Every time. Not out of ego, but out of truth. Because when you stop chasing, you stop bleeding. When you stop explaining, you start influencing. And when you stop reacting, you become untouchable. Not because you're above pain, but because you've made peace with it. You felt the fire and chose not to burn again. Now you walk through life with stillness in your chest, a silence that intimidates noise, and a presence that doesn't need permission to be powerful. You are no longer made of nerves. You are made of knowing. You don't dodge the arrows. You outgrow the battlefield. And the next time they try to provoke the old version of you, there's nothing left for them to touch. You are not broken. You were just never taught how to feel without drowning, how to care without collapsing, how to love without losing yourself. But now you know. Emotion isn't weakness. It's fuel. And the ones who burn it blindly become slaves to their own fire. You've seen it. How men unravel for attention. How they give everything to people who give nothing back. How they confuse chaos with depth, pain with love, neediness with connection. But that ends now, because today, you reclaim your power, not by building walls, but by building clarity, not by becoming cold, but by becoming conscious. You are no longer here to prove your worth through sacrifice. You are no longer begging to be chosen. You are no longer bleeding to feel alive. You are here to choose, to observe, to master your state, because a man who understands his own emotions cannot be manipulated. A man who doesn't chase approval becomes magnetic. A man who can sit in silence without needing to be rescued becomes dangerous. Not to others, but to the system that profits off his emotional confusion. So, remember this. Stillness is not emptiness. It's direction. Restraint is not weakness. It's precision. And love, real love, begins the moment you stop seeking it to fill the hole you refuse to understand. Now, breathe. Sit back, feel your body, and realize, for the first time in your life, you're not chasing, you're not reacting, you're not performing, you're just here. Clear, unbothered, untouched, like a man who walked through fire and came out, carrying the flame, not to burn others, but to light his own path, in silence, with gravity and absolute freedom. If this message lit something in you, subscribe, support via super thanks, and walk this path with us.